Hello everyone, my name is Chris Titley and welcome to the FinTech Australia podcast. The FinTech Australia podcast takes listeners on a deep dive across the FinTech industry in Australia, focusing on the challenges, opportunities and big stories our community faces. Let's get to today's episode. Hi, it's Chris Titley here as part of the FinTech Australia podcast series. I'm joined by Karl Durrance, Managing Director ANZ at Stripe. Karl, thanks so much for being part of this podcast.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the invitation, Chris.
Karl, a lot of the listeners do know a little bit about Stripe, but I'm keen to understand a little bit about what Stripe is doing locally and how they're involved in the FinTech ecosystem here in Australia.
Sure. So, quickly stepping back for those who may not be as familiar, Stripe is a financial infrastructure platform where we have this broad mission to increase the GDP of the internet. And I think probably a better way of understanding who we are and what we do is what we're doing with customers and the way that brings that to life. And so we're probably most renowned for being a payments partner for organizations and helping businesses to be able to accept payments on the internet and digitally. And that would be in the likes of helping power checkouts like Amazon and the Iconic and these kind of fairly large e-commerce companies. But we also do a range of other things associated with the management and movement of money inside business. And so that would be helping organizations with their digital invoicing, helping them calculate their sales tax, running billing systems and helping them to create subscription relationships with the customers. And in some regions, not available here in Australia yet, but available for Australian businesses operating in the US and the UK, providing embedded finance and banking as a service capabilities. And so that would be the likes of credit card issuing, providing access to short-term working capital loans and virtual bank accounts through our treasury offering. And my role is to help Australian and New Zealand businesses to be as successful as they can be in the digital economy through using the Stripe platform.
I'm keen to understand a little bit more about the numbers of countries that Stripe's in and also the presence here that you have and the team on the ground in terms of the numbers and where you're based.
Yeah, so we have we have about 500,000 customers here in Australia, and they range from some of the earliest stage, smallest startups through to small business, mid-sized enterprise, and even government departments using us. We are available in just on 50 countries around the world, and so that provides a fairly good platform for businesses to go global. And about 30,000 businesses in Australia do some form of cross-border commerce on our platform every month, right? So essentially, we are helping Australian businesses to digitally export. We've got a modest team. We don't share exact team numbers here at Stripe, but we've got people on the ground across Sydney and Melbourne.
Excellent. Now, more recently, Karl, there was a report that was attributed to yourself and Wei Li from the University of Sydney Business School titled "What It Takes for Business to Compete in the Digital Economy." Certainly very relevant in this economy for small businesses and businesses alike. Do you want to give the listeners a little bit of an understanding about the report, how the inputs went into the report and the success on the back of it?
Yeah, we've been doing a ton of research this year to try to get an understanding of, what are the levers that are really driving growth for business. And this report with the University of Sydney Business School was one that focused a lot on the role of digital payment methods and, what are they being used for? How are businesses looking at them? What are they? Why are they investing in it and what the outcome is? And so it was a really interesting report. We surveyed 1,000 businesses here in Australia. So this is hyper localized research, and found that actually the way that Australian businesses were looking at digital payments was probably in summary threefold. The first was about 73% of the respondents suggested that it was all about customer experience. And this kind of true for us because we've been on a mantra of, I guess, trying to educate the market that customer experience is payment experience, and that equals business growth, right? And so to see that actually the biggest driver for investing in adding digital payment methods, and what I mean by that is both classically in like an e-commerce checkout, right? And maybe you're supporting Visa card, MasterCard, but adding other novel payment methods like BNPLs, etc. What is that doing for the CX? And so fairly meaningful. And then the other thing is around relationship improvement. So over 80% of businesses seeing it as a direct impact to the relationship that they have with their customers just by adding different and more payment methods. And it comes down to this very simple concept, which is if you have a customer who wants to pay, get out of the way and help them achieve that. Because I guess one of the other things that we know is that when it comes to cart abandonment and the impact that has on the top line for a business operating on the internet, it's still a fairly big challenge, right? About 70% of carts go abandoned as part of like an e-commerce kind of metric of performance, which means only 30% of your customers are actually transacting. This is at an aggregate level. And one of the biggest contributors to cart abandonment is the fact that consumers don't have their either most trusted or favorite payment method available. So all these things kind of feed each other. And so this research was about unpacking that and trying to understand the impacts and also the investment going into that space.
Karl, I'm interested to know about that particular user experience. I mean, looking at a major e-com retailer, Kogan, for instance, a couple of years ago, they would have 6 or 7 different buy now, pay later options and their own option and other options, etc. Is there overkill, or is overkill good?
No, yeah, absolutely there is. I think there's this magic point, right, where too much choice is crippling. Too little choice, and what you're doing is potentially missing a conversion opportunity. And so that's why it's not just about having tons of choice. It's then also being intelligent in presenting the right choices. And there's lots of ways of doing that. I think there's a high degree of know your customer, know your market, know your demographic. And then, there are certain payment methods that are well suited to certain types of industry and product, right? And so those kind of things are more around a business judgment call. But then when we look at what we're doing at Stripe around our managed checkout and our elements capability of embedding essentially, a really well managed and designed checkout experience into an online store, and then allowing Stripe to present the payment methods that are most likely to convert, either based on device that the person's browsing on, based on their location. So if they're browsing from Southeast Asia, we'll make sure that you're supporting and presenting Southeast Asian payment methods that make sense to the consumer there, right? So there's a whole ton of that where you need to both make good choices and partner with the likes of Stripe to optimize that experience. So definitely too many is bad, too little is bad. It's like somewhere in the middle.
Yep, excellent. And Karl, shifting away from e-com, but to small businesses and the receivables and getting paid and ensuring that their staff can be paid on time. It's a big problem in Australia. What's Stripe doing, and what did this report uncover in that instance?
Yeah, because I think when we think of digital payment methods, sometimes we immediately think of just a classic e-commerce checkout, right? But it is more than that. We've had a really long-standing partnership with Xero, and I think this is kind of where this brings it to life. And one of the things we've done with them is to help enable digital payment of invoices, right? So when a Xero invoice is issued, being able to have like a pay now button on that to capture that moment of attention when the invoice is received, to allow that payment conversion to happen in the moment, right? Now, Xero have done research on that, and they've found that their customers that enable that get paid on average about 14 days faster.
Yeah, right. Wow.
So that's a pretty big deal for a small business. The research also called out that about 50% of businesses right now, and a lot of this is based on the current economic climate, are suggesting that late payment is actually like it's crucially impacting their survival.
Yeah. Yep.
right? So anything you can do to reduce the friction of payment is going to improve cash flow and ultimately help businesses to be able to weather the storm. And um, so yeah, it's not just e-commerce checkout. This is also for far more traditional payment methods like invoicing, whether it be B2C or B2B.
Yeah, and Carl, in terms of the COVID period in 2020, we saw a rise and uptick of QR codes and different methods to pay, etc. Are those methods holding on through the COVID period into sort of more mainstream now, and there are different types of ways that people are paying now?
There are. I think we saw in the research that QR code and payment links are certainly being used in sectors like retail. It's not as prevalent as some of the more traditional payment methods that we all know and love. I think from an Australian perspective, we are still a very card heavy nation, and that's both from an in-person payments perspective and also in a digital commerce perspective. If we look across to other nations and areas like in Asia, and in particular, I mentioned Southeast Asia before, but Southeast Asia has had huge adoption of QR code based payments and a lesser adoption of cards. Right, they haven't had the huge penetration over the years of a nation like Australia. So I think these other payment methods are certainly they're taking hold and they're being provided as alternatives. But as a proportion to the total, they're still pretty small. But it's exciting, right? I think that merchants are experimenting, and I think the one thing that we've also learned from this research is that consumers are ahead of the merchants right now when it comes to tech adoption, when it comes to their experience in paying for things in lots of different ways, whether it be locally in Australia, but also as they travel abroad and they're being exposed to these alternative payment methods. And so, look, it's an interesting time. I think there's tons of ways for consumers to pay right now.
And from a business point of view, in adopting new digital payment methods, the report also suggested that fraud and security was a major concern. Can you talk about that and what Stripe's doing and to sort of alleviate some of those concerns?
Yeah, look, so fraud certainly, it was about 54%, I think, of businesses were looking at it as a concern, right? So as their businesses continue to scale digitally, how do they deal with this ever-present threat, right? I think that when we look at fraud as a percentage of total, whilst fraud is rising, so is total payment volume. And so as a proportion to the total, it's remained pretty steady for a number of years. It's still huge. And I think there are a few things that businesses are looking to employ. I think that some of the new digital payment methods help to address it fairly significantly. Like when we look at the innovations in digital wallets like Apple Pay and the fact that each transaction is biometrically authenticated, it provides a fairly trustworthy transaction position for a merchant in the fact that, from a dispute perspective, the disputes are really low because the transactions are authenticated, right? It's very similar to in essence, like a 3DS kind of authenticated transaction, except the friction on the consumer is much lower. So those kind of things, I think, are going to continue to make sure that that merchants and consumers can stay ahead of fraud. I think the bigger concern actually is scams, right? Like scams is 6x the impact of fraud. And when we look at the more traditional mechanisms that we have, like authenticated transactions, and the technology constantly evolving, it doesn't solve for scams because scams is more of a social engineering challenge. It's more of a financial literacy challenge. And so I think that's where we're probably going to see a lot more investment holistically, not just from Stripe. I think as just as an economy and for the financial sector, it's a huge challenge. But yeah, look, it's not lost on us that when businesses continue to lean into the digital economy, it's a challenge that they face.
Carl, one final question. Are you excited about the future of digital payments in Australia and the, siphoning on into the FinTech ecosystem? And, FinTech's had a bit of a rough time, but, Stripe's doing some really good things behind the scenes. And what gets you up in the morning to become excited?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a super exciting time, right? Like when we look at the fact that in this research, we found that almost 50%, it was 46% of businesses plan to invest in and release a new digital payment method in the next 12 months. So, what that means is businesses are leaning into this opportunity. They can see that this is an ever evolving space. And in order to engage with the consumer, they need to continue to invest. And, from my perspective and my team's perspective, we want Australian businesses to be the most digitally fluent, digitally successful business on the planet. And, the world's pretty small now on the internet. And so they're competing with global entrants that are coming in. And so that gets me excited. I think there's also this great opportunity for Australian businesses to continue to expand globally. 74% of the respondents said that having digital payment methods and having those available across the globe, like our global reach at Stripe, helps them to expand their business from Australia. And so, I'm really passionate about having Australian businesses be globally successful, being able to have them do that from here and run a global business from Australia. And again, I think that technologies like Stripe enable organizations to do that. And then finally, there's some really cool tech right now from an innovation perspective, in particular in mobile. So this year we launched Tap to Pay on Android and Tap to Pay on iPhone. And what that is turning just a standard iPhone or Android handset into a payment terminal. And so we can now have scenarios where small businesses can suddenly take payment just by pulling out their phone and getting someone to tap plastic or phone on phone to take payment. It can be large businesses using it for queue busting and providing a more intimate payment experience. So there's tons of innovation right now in digital payments that presents it's an incredible opportunity for Australian business.
I can see that Tap to Pay, certainly, the effects and the tangible benefits of being paid instantly versus potential lost money or forgotten invoices, or particularly tradies or people that do lots of jobs and may forget something. Obviously that's going to be a very exciting area for Stripe, when traditionally known as an online payment. So, on that question, I've got one more final question. The offline versus online. What do you want to see Stripe sort of position yourself as here locally?
We've got this term called unified commerce, and we're seeing it as kind of like the omni-channel V2, right? I think when we traditionally think of omni-channel, it's where an organization has the ability to transact with customers in multiple channels, right? And so it could be in store, it could be on the internet, it could be social commerce on a social media platform. But generally speaking, those interfaces aren't integrated. The user journey is not integrated and fragmented, and it doesn't really respect the fact that a modern buyer may actually interact with your brand in all of those channels before conducting a transaction, right? And so a unified commerce concept is having a single customer record, letting customers begin and end the transaction journey in any of the channels, and providing that single integrated view of settlement of monies and also of customer behavior for the merchant. And so we're investing a ton in that space. This year here in Australia, we have launched our physical terminal offerings, and so that closes the gap there. But to be really clear, it's not like we're just going after in-person payments with our terminal. Actually, what gets us up and gets us excited is that integrated experience of e-com and in-person, and bringing that together. That's where that's our future bread and butter.
Brilliant, Karl. Thank you so much for the chat today and understanding Stripe's presence locally. Been touted as one of the largest private fintechs in the world. It's great to have you on the ground here and being at the events, and I really appreciate all the support you've shown for FinTech Australia, and looking forward to in real life events and catching up at Stripe events and catching up in FinTech Australia events soon.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed the chat.
Thanks for listening to the FinTech Australia podcast. I'm your host, Chris Titley. The FinTech Australia podcast is a collaboration between FinTech Australia and Sub11. For more information about membership options, news and the events coming up, jump on to the FinTech Australia website. Have a great day. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.